A police officer found an elderly veteran grieving at her husband's grave after hours. He tossed and cuffed the 72-year-old for trespassing. He didn't know the old woman's Marine brothers were already on their way. The silence in Oak Creek National Cemetery was a physical presence, a heavy, sacred blanket draped over the rolling hills. For Sergeant Major Francesca Frankie Monroe, U.S. Marine Corps, retired, that silence was a conversation. At 72, she stood before the new granite headstone, the name Edward Monroe, still sharp and painfully new. The funeral had ended hours ago. The last well-meaning relative had offered a final, sad smile and retreated, leaving her alone with the ghosts and the grief. She wore a simple, dark pantsuit, the fabric impeccably pressed. Pinned to her lapel was a single, discreet service medal, a quiet testament to a life of honor and discipline. Her spine, once as straight as a rifle barrel, was now slightly stooped with age and sorrow, but her stance remained rooted, unyielding. In one hand, she gripped a small, velvet pouch. It held a letter she had written to Edward during his first deployment to Vietnam, a lifetime ago. A letter filled with the hopes and fears of a young wife, a letter he had never read. She had always meant to show it to him, to laugh with him about her youthful anxieties. But time, the ultimate thief, had stolen that chance. The groundskeeper had passed by an hour earlier, slowing his cart, offering a quiet, respectful nod. He knew who she was. Everyone in this small military town knew Sergeant Major Frankie Monroe. She was a legend, a woman who had carved a path of excellence through a corps dominated by men, earning a reputation for being tougher, smarter, and fiercer than any of her male counterparts. But today, she was not a legend. She was just a widow, trying to finish one last conversation. The iron gates of the cemetery clanged shut around 6 p.m., the sound echoing in the twilight. The lanterns along the chapel path flickered on, casting a soft, golden glow. Still, Frankie stayed. One last goodbye, she whispered to the cool stone, her voice a raw rasp. Just one more moment, my love. With hands that trembled only slightly, she unfolded the brittle, faded paper. The ink was faint, but the words were burned into her memory. Her voice cracked as she began to read aloud, the words meant only for him, carried away by the evening breeze. My dearest Edward, if you're reading this, it means you made it home. The rest of the sentence was swallowed by the sudden glare of headlights. A single police cruiser crunched slowly up the gravel path, its bright beams unforgiving in the gathering dark. Frankie squinted, shielding her eyes, but she did not move from the grave. A young officer, tall and broad-shouldered, emerged from the car. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face a mask of stern, procedural importance. He walked with a clipped urgency, his hand already resting near his duty belt. "Ma'am, the cemetery is closed," the officer called out, his voice sharp, devoid of any warmth. "You are trespassing." Frankie blinked, slowly folding the precious letter. "I was just leaving, officer," she said, her voice heavy with the grief he had just interrupted. The officer paused, perhaps for a split second, hearing the raw pain in her tone. But then procedure, a rigid and unthinking God, took over. "I need you to step away from the grave site and come with me, ma'am." Frankie looked at Edward's name, the letters blurring through a sudden film of tears. "Can I please have one more minute?" "No, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "This is city property. You've already stayed past posted hours. We have to clear the area." A slow breath escaped Frankie's lungs. An old instinct, buried under decades of civilian life, stirred within her. She was a sergeant major. This boy, this child in a uniform, was speaking to her as if she were a common delinquent. Yet, she complied. She took a step back, not in fear, but with the weary resignation of someone who knew when a fight wasn't worth having. She reached into her coat, retrieved her ID, and handed it to him. "Sergeant Major Francesca Monroe," she said, her voice steady now. "He was my husband for 45 years. I just needed to finish saying goodbye." The officer glanced at the ID, at the rank, but no recognition registered in his young, impassive eyes. He saw only an old woman who was breaking the rules. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I have a possible vagrant at Oak Creek. Refusing to leave the premises." Frankie heard every word. A dull ache spread through her chest. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. She slowly, wearily, lowered herself onto the small stone bench beside the headstone. The officer stepped forward, his agitation growing. "Ma'am, stand up. Now. You are resisting a lawful order." "I'm not resisting," Frankie said calmly, her voice tired. "I'm remembering." But he didn't care. He reached for her wrist. "You'll need to come with me." The metallic click of the handcuff was a deafening, obscene sound in the sacred quiet of the cemetery. The cold steel bit into the thin, fragile skin of Frankie's wrist. She stared at it, not with panic, but with a surreal sense of disbelief. She had worn uniforms, carried weapons, faced down enemies of the state, but she had never, in her 72 years, worn handcuffs. What are you doing?" she whispered, the question not one of defiance, but of genuine, stunned confusion. "You refuse to comply," the young officer stated, his voice a flat recitation from a training manual. He seemed to be operating on autopilot, his lack of empathy making his actions all the more cruel. He pulled her to her feet, his grip too firm, his movements too rough for a woman of her age. The stumble was inevitable. Her old joints, stiff with grief and cold, buckled beneath her. It wasn't resistance, it was the simple mechanics of an aging body pushed beyond its limits. But the officer misread it. He saw defiance where there was only pain. "Stay still, ma'am. Don't make this harder," he commanded, tightening his grip. And then, because she had stumbled, because he had lost control of the situation, he made a decision that would echo far beyond the iron gates of Oak Creek. He unholstered his taser. The sound of the weapon charging, a high-pitched, electric whine, was a desecration. "I am ordering you to comply," he shouted, his own voice now laced with a thread of panic. Frankie looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster, but a frightened boy playing dress-up with deadly toys. He was out of his depth, and he was about to make an unforgivable mistake. The twin probes of the taser struck her in the back. Her world exploded in a blinding flash of white-hot, electric agony. Her muscles seized, her body convulsing uncontrollably as 50,000 volts coursed through her. She collapsed onto the damp grass beside her husband's grave, the sacred ground now a scene of brutal, senseless violence. At that exact moment, 2 miles away, the phone rang in the home of Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez. He was an active-duty Marine, 28 years old, home on leave. He was cleaning his rifle when he saw the caller ID, Bill Henderson, an old Army vet who lived in a small house bordering the cemetery. "Tommy," Bill's voice was a panicked whisper. "Something's wrong at Oak Creek. It's Frankie. A cop's got her on the ground. I think he tossed her." The world stopped. Tommy's hands, so steady just a moment before, began to shake with a furious energy. Frankie. Sergeant Major Monroe. The woman who had taken him, a directionless 19-year-old, under her wing at the VFW Hall. The woman who had drilled him on Marine Corps history until he could recite it in his sleep, who had taught him how to press his uniform, how to shine his shoes, how to carry himself with a quiet pride. She was more than a mentor, she was a matriarch, a living legend to every young serviceman and woman in their town. The resolve that formed in Tommy's chest was not a decision, it was an instinct. It was the primal roar of a young lion whose pride's elder had just been attacked. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He hung up the phone. His mission was no longer cleaning his rifle. He walked to his closet and took out his A-class dress blue uniform. He began to dress, his movements precise, deliberate. Then, he made 5 more phone calls. The message was the same. It's Frankie. They put their hands on Frankie. Dress blues. 10 minutes. As Tommy Rodriguez drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind was a storm of memories. He wasn't just driving to a cemetery, he was driving to defend a cornerstone of his life. The flashback was vivid. He was 19, fresh out of boot camp, home on his first leave. He felt lost, caught between the hyperstructured world of the Marine Corps and a civilian life that no longer fit. He'd been in the VFW hall, trying to drink away his confusion, when she had approached him. He had seen Sergeant Major Monroe before, of course. She was a local icon. But he had never spoken to her. "You look like a man trying to figure out which direction is forward, Marine," she'd said, her ice blue eyes seeing right through his tough guy facade. Her voice was raspy, like fine grit sandpaper, but her presence was a force of nature. Over the next few years, she became his compass. She never coddled him. She was tough, demanding, and held him to a standard he didn't even know he was capable of. She'd inspect his uniform before he returned to base, her sharp eyes spotting a single loose thread from 10 feet away. She'd drill him on leadership principles, on the unwritten codes of honor that separate a warrior from a thug. She spoke often of her husband, Edward, an army man, and the good-natured rivalry between their branches. She taught him that the uniform wasn't just something you wore, it was something you had to earn, every single day. "The most important part of your gear, Rodriguez," she had told him once, her voice firm, "is not your rifle. It's your integrity. It's the only thing the enemy can't take from you, but you can give it away for free. Don't ever give it away." The memory fueled the cold fire in his belly. The officer who had tossed Frankie hadn't just assaulted an elderly woman, he had violated an institution. He had attacked the very integrity she embodied. Tommy's plan, formulated in the heat of his rage, was one of pure, symbolic power. There would be no violence. There would be no shouting. That was their enemy's language. His intelligence told him that the greatest weapon against chaotic, dishonorable force was its exact opposite: perfect, overwhelming, silent discipline. His phone buzzed as he pulled up near the cemetery gates. The other 5 Marines had arrived, as he knew they would. They were already changing in their cars. "What's the plan, Sergeant?" a young corporal asked over the line. Tommy looked at the cemetery gates, at the single police cruiser parked insensitively on the grass. "The plan is simple," he said, his voice resonating with the authority Frankie had taught him. "A-class uniforms. Highest military bearing. We are going to remind that officer what honor looks like. We are going to escort a sergeant major of the United States Marine Corps home. Now, form up." They assembled just outside the gates, 6 young men in their immaculate dress blues, medals gleaming in the dusk. Their movements were synchronized, their faces set like stone. They were not there as individuals, they were there as a single, unified embodiment of the Corps. Their mission was clear: restore honor, correct a grievous wrong, and stand by their own. The 6 Marines entered the cemetery not with a rush, but with a slow, deliberate, and utterly chilling procession. They formed a perfect 2x3 column and began to march up the gravel path, their polished shoes striking the ground in perfect, rhythmic unison. Step. Click. Silence. Step. Click. Silence. The sound cut through the night, a heartbeat of pure discipline that was more intimidating than any siren. The young police officer, who was trying to radio his supervisor while keeping an eye on the now-dazed Frankie, heard the sound first. He turned, his face a mask of confusion. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 figures, emerging from the twilight like avenging spirits, their dress blue uniforms a stark, formal contrast to the messy reality of the scene he had created. They didn't look at him. They didn't acknowledge him. They just advanced, their collective gaze fixed on the small, crumpled figure of Frankie Monroe. This was a psychological operation, executed with military precision. The Marines' perfect formation, their immaculate uniforms, their utter silence, it was all designed to communicate one thing: you have violated our world. You have crossed a line into a place governed by rules you do not understand. And now, we are here. The officer's authority, which he had wielded so carelessly just moments before, evaporated. He was no longer a lawman in control, he was a lone, out-of-his-depth individual facing a unified force he could not comprehend. His hand, which had so easily deployed a taser, now trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. Tommy Rodriguez led the column. He halted them 5 yards from the scene, the single command, "Halt," a sharp crack in the air. The 6 men stopped as one, a wall of silent, blue-uniformed judgment. Only then did Tommy break formation. He walked forward alone, his steps measured, his back straight. He didn't look at Frankie yet. He addressed the officer, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of ice that made the young cop flinch. "What is the charge, officer?" Tommy asked. The officer blinked, thrown off balance by the formal inquiry. "Trespassing," he stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Resisting arrest." Tommy's eyes flickered to the taser wires still connected to Frankie's back, then to the handcuffs on her wrists. He then looked at her face, at the raw pain and humiliation there. His own expression remained a mask of professional calm, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Resisting?" Tommy's voice was dangerously soft. "Officer, you have a 72-year-old, decorated sergeant major of the Marine Corps in handcuffs, on the ground, at her husband's grave. I suggest you reassess your definition of resistance." The psychological attack was devastating. Tommy wasn't shouting or threatening. He was using facts, rank, and a profound sense of righteousness as his weapons. He was dismantling the officer's justification, piece by piece, in front of a growing crowd of neighbors who had begun to gather at the cemetery gates, their cell phones recording the incredible scene. The young officer, utterly outmaneuvered, could only stare, his authority dissolving in the face of a higher, more ancient code. The young officer, whose name tag read Blevins, scrambled to reassert his authority, falling back on the only thing he had left, the rulebook. "Sir, with all due respect, this woman was on private property after closing hours. She refused multiple lawful orders to vacate. My actions were in accordance with departmental procedure for dealing with a non-compliant individual." Tommy Rodriguez took another slow, deliberate step forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Procedure," Tommy repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked from Blevins's panicked eyes to Frankie's still form, a wave of protective fury making his vision sharpen. "Let me tell you about procedure, officer. The procedure for a grieving widow is compassion. The procedure for a 72-year-old woman is patience. And the procedure for a sergeant major who has given more to this country than you could possibly comprehend, is an unwavering, profound, and absolute respect." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Some procedures are printed in a manual to protect a city from liability. Other procedures are carved into the soul of this nation by the blood of its warriors to protect its honor. You, officer, have confused the two." This verbal takedown was the final blow to the officer's legitimacy. He had no response. His entire justification, built on the flimsy foundation of a trespassing ordinance, crumbled under the moral weight of Tommy's argument. The crowd at the gates, hearing every word, murmured in agreement. It was at that moment that the cemetery director, a flustered man named Peterson, finally arrived, waving a clipboard. "Wait. Stop," he panted, out of breath. "There's been a mistake. Mrs. Monroe has written permission. It's in the funeral file. She was granted extended visitation rights for the first week. It's right here." He thrust the paper forward. This was the final, procedural checkmate. Officer Blevins's actions were now stripped of even their last, pathetic shred of legal justification. They were not just immoral, they were factually, demonstrably wrong. His face drained of all remaining color. He had assaulted an elderly woman who had every right to be there. Tommy didn't even glance at the paper. He didn't need to. He looked at Blevins with a finality that was terrifying. "You've done enough," he said, his voice low and firm. Then, he turned his back on the officer, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked to Frankie, knelt down on one knee, and looked into her eyes. The authority was gone, replaced by the deep, heartfelt respect of a young soldier for his commander, his mentor, his friend. "Sergeant Major," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We're here to take you home." He pulled the key for the handcuffs from Blevins's unresisting belt, and with a steady hand, he unlocked the steel cuffs from Frankie's wrists. The sound of the cuffs clicking open was the true sound of liberation. It was the sound of honor defeating disgrace. As he helped Frankie to her feet, two of his Marines moved to support her, not restraining her, but offering their strength, their arms a steady bulwark against her trembling. They formed a protective V formation around her, shielding her from the prying eyes and the now impotent officer. Officer Blevins stood alone, a pariah in his own jurisdiction, his radio crackling with the voice of a supervisor who was, by now, undoubtedly on his way. The reckoning for his actions was just beginning. But for the 6 Marines and the woman they had come to save, the battle was already won. They had restored order, not with violence, but with the unshakable power of their code. With the handcuffs removed, the Marines did not rush Frankie away. They stood with her, a silent, blue-uniformed honor guard, as she turned back to her husband's grave. One of the young men gently picked up the crumpled letter from the damp grass and placed it back into her trembling hand. And there, protected by the unwavering presence of her military sons, Frankie Monroe finished her goodbye. She read the final lines of the letter, her voice a reedy whisper, but clear and strong. The Marines stood at parade rest, their faces impassive, but their presence a profound statement. They were standing guard over her grief, ensuring this sacred moment would not be violated again. The videos, of course, went viral. The image of the 6 immaculate Marines marching into the dark cemetery, followed by the footage of Tommy unlocking Frankie's handcuffs, became a national symbol. It sparked a fierce debate about police training, respect for veterans, and common decency. The young officer faced a severe internal investigation and was ultimately dismissed from the force, his career over. But Frankie wanted no part of the media circus. She didn't want revenge. When a veterans aid organization, moved by her story, raised a significant sum of money for her, she accepted it with quiet grace. A few weeks later, she walked into the VFW hall where Tommy Rodriguez and his Marines were gathered. She didn't make a speech. She simply handed them a check. "This is for the Evelyn and Edward Monroe Honor Fund," she announced, her voice steady. "For any veteran, male or female, who finds themselves in trouble and needs a brother or sister to stand with them." Her pain had been transformed into a promise. Her personal ordeal became a new mission, to ensure that no veteran in her community would ever have to face a crisis alone. She still visited Edward's grave twice a week, always dressed in her best. But now, she was rarely alone. Often, a young Marine or soldier would be there, standing a respectful distance away, just keeping watch. They didn't have to. But they did. Because she was Frankie. And they were her family. This story teaches us that honor has no expiration date, and brotherhood knows no uniform. It's a quiet promise, kept not with loud declarations, but with steadfast presence in the darkest moments. It is a testament to the enduring strength of a warrior's spirit. How does your community honor its veterans? Share your stories in the comments below. If this story of loyalty and respect moved you, please like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share it with someone who understands the meaning of having someone's back. And comment SEMPER FI to show your support.